Welcome to the second session of the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office's Saving the Sacred webinar series. Today's session is Albatross or Assets, Adaptive Reuse of Sacred Places. Our presenter today is Shelly Stackhouse, Senior Director of Programs. The Reverend Dr. Rochelle Stackhouse was ordained in the United Church of Christ in 1982. A graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, she has served churches of varying sizes in senior, solo, and interim pastor in 6 states. She received a PhD in liturgical studies from Drew University and has taught at several seminaries, most recently Lexington and Yale. Since coming to Partners in 2021, she has worked in many Partners services and programs, including working with staff to develop and pilot the use of new tools for transition services. Her areas of expertise include public speaking and presentations, shepherding older and historic church buildings, and strategic visioning. Shelly has completed the classroom requirements for the Level 1 coaching credentials from the International Coaching Federation. Shelly lives in Philadelphia with her husband and 2 quirky cats. So Shelly, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Delighted to be with you all today from sunny Philadelphia.
Oh, Shelly, we cannot hear you well.
How is that any better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Great to be with you all from sunny Philadelphia, and delighted to have this conversation with you about sacred places and assets or albatross. And I will get to that metaphor in a minute. I want to say a few words about Partners for Sacred Places, because I don't know if you all know who we are. Partners is a national, nonprofit, non-sectarian organization that works with older and historic congregations and their sacred places. We are working, as we say, at the intersection of heritage and faith and community, because we believe that a historic sacred place is not to be preserved simply to preserve it, but because it is a community asset. And so we like to help faith communities to figure out how these assets can be best used to serve their communities, as well as being preserved for future generations. So that's who Partners is. We do a lot of things. We work for individual clients in doing community engagement, in doing fundraising, and strategic visioning for property. We also have the National Fund for Sacred Places that we administer in coordination with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The National Fund is funded by the Lilly Endowment, and it's open to congregations of any faith with historic properties that are still being used by an active congregation, but have capital needs. And these grants range from $50,000 to $500,000, and they are a matching grant program. We can talk more about that at the end if you're interested in it. I will say it's extremely competitive. We get about 400 applications, and we give out about 40. However, I will tell you that we don't have a lot of applications from Oklahoma. So this could be an opportunity for us to have a chat about that before the end of my presentation. Let me say a word about the asset or albatross metaphor. Those of you who remember your high school or college English may remember a poem called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. In that poem by Longfellow, I'm going to make this story very short. A person on a ship mistakenly or intentionally actually shoots down an albatross. And an albatross is a very large seabird, very large. It is considered lucky for sailors to have an albatross in their vicinity. And so killing the albatross meant bad luck for the ship. And the sailors hung the albatross around this man's neck and forced him to carry this dead and rotting thing for the trip. You can read the poem and learn more about what happened in the end. But this image of having an albatross around your neck, something that is weighing you down, pulling you down, A lot of folk who are in historic or just old buildings in sacred places feel like sometimes that property is pulling them down, keeping them from being able to do what they want to do because it's expensive and time consuming and volunteer time consuming. So what we're going to talk about today a bit is understanding those albatrosses to be actually assets. So I want to tell you a little bit about how partners got to this. 20 or so years ago, we were a young organization, and our founder and early staff realized that one of the issues for sacred places was that as congregations become smaller and smaller, as they're unable financially to keep up buildings, there was a real loss to the community when those places closed. So they commissioned a study with the University of Pennsylvania to look at the role of historic houses of worship in community development and health. And as they did this, one of the major things they discovered, and that's what the chart is on this slide, is that approximately 81% of the beneficiaries of the programs and the space that were operated by any given urban congregation, about 81% of those were non-members, and that a smaller group of members were served by the property. More than 75% of congregations used at that point in time their buildings to meet basic human needs: food, clothing, job training, etc. And that the average congregation provided more than 5,000 hours of volunteer support to its community. This was mind-boggling because a number of these folk had no idea that congregations provided this kind of a service. The value of resources contributed to community serving programs is often more than $200,000 per congregation. These are older numbers, so it may even be more so now. And 76% of all the services provided were located within a congregation's own building. So that prompted partners to begin to wonder, is there a way that we can say what the value of historic sacred places is in a way that will communicate with folk who don't think about anecdotes, but think about dollars? Is there a way to monetize the value of historic sacred places and older buildings in those for those faith communities? So in 2010, William Penn Foundation, which is a local Philadelphia foundation, funded us to work with the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania to see if we could quantify the public value of a congregation, looking at the factors here on the slide: local spending, local hiring, investment in building repairs, visitor spending, activities that promote community economic development, the impact on individual lives, and green space and recreation space that's often provided. They began this study of urban congregations. So Philadelphia, Chicago, and Fort Worth were the early study. And what they discovered is that over $1 million, $1.7 million, was the average economic contribution of any given sacred place to its community in an average year. I want you to hear that again: $1.7 million. So to get at that figure, they looked at if a congregation has any kind of an education program, a preschool, any kind of a school, actually, including daycare. And then they looked at, especially with daycare, if that allowed a parent to work full time when they couldn't have otherwise done so, that's an enormous economic benefit to a community. They looked at direct spending. Where does the church buy its toilet paper? How do they pay their staff, who then spend their money in the community? When they have to hire a plumber to fix a toilet, they hire someone from within the community. What kind of direct spending do they do that impacts the community? Catalytic and magnet effect spending. The magnet effect is called, let's say you're going to a wedding and you're traveling there from out of town. You're going to potentially stay in a hotel. You're going to eat meals. The folk who have the wedding at your church are going to spend money in order to make that happen, especially if the reception happens to be at your church. Or you're going to host a concert from a local organization. People are going to come. They might come to you and they might eat in a local restaurant. The people who are performing might come and rehearse and stop at a coffee shop or a lunch shop. Magnet effect, money that is spent in the community because of people coming to this particular building. And then an invisible safety net. These are things like providing food, providing clothing, providing counseling services, all sorts of things that make a difference to the life of a community. So the reason that we wanted to monetize this, well, let me go on a sec and say we did a subsequent study in rural North Carolina because we wanted to see, is this true also of rural congregations? And the number there was $735,800 in an average year. And this study was done just pre-pandemic, right before the pandemic. So in rural communities, often these places are even more valuable because in many parts of rural America, as I'm sure many of you know well, there are very few places where large numbers of people can gather. And churches often provide that space, that third space, where people can gather, where people can have meetings, where people or AA groups can gather, where all sorts of things can happen, where there is nowhere else perhaps in that community that can take place. The reason we wanted to monetize this is several reasons. One is that churches often think, well, we're valuable because, we host an AA group or we offer worship on a Sunday morning, but churches often undervalue the are to their communities. We wanted churches and synagogues to know that they have value in their communities, and we wanted to be able to put a dollar number around that, as imperfect as it may be. But even more so, a lot of civic leaders, a lot of philanthropists have no idea. They drive past a church, and if they're not a member, or a synagogue, and if they're not a member of an organized religious institution, they don't know what happens there. They think the Methodist church is just for the Methodists, or the local synagogue is just for the Jewish people in the neighborhood. They don't understand that they have a much bigger impact than that. And because often government officials and philanthropists think in dollar numbers, not in anecdotes, we were able to do this. So we do economic halo studies for individual congregations if they want to know, but just knowing these figures in general, I think provides a really important understanding of the asset that is these sacred places. So today we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the subject of what we call transitions. And I need to, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean about that word in a minute. But first I want to tell you what we're seeing. Generally across the board, and I think, Oklahoma may have some exceptions to this because you're still in Bible Belt, and I'll be anxious to hear from you all at the end what you're seeing. But we work all over the country. And so even in places that traditionally have had a higher participation in organized religion, we're still seeing this. The congregations are shrinking in size and in resources. And those resources include both dollars and volunteers. The shrinking of those volunteers is as valuable as the shrinkage of money. The other thing we're seeing is because of that, older sacred places are often underused. There are a lot of sacred places where very little happens in a lot of the parts of the building or buildings on days other than Sunday. I was just in a rural church, a set of 6 churches that are kind of in a partnership in northern rural Indiana. And 2 of those churches sit completely empty, except for Sunday morning. So there's a lot of underused space there that could be an asset to the community, and not only inside the building, but land. A lot of congregations own an amount of land that is very valuable in a variety of ways. And we'll talk more about the land. And a lot of times, sacred places don't understand the value, even urban sacred places, the value of land they may have and parking lots they may have. Civic leaders, as I've said, are often completely unaware of that this is happening, or what congregations have to offer them in terms of space and other assets. So that's what we're seeing, and I'll look forward to hearing more from you as you put things in the Q&A about what you are seeing out there. So what do we mean by transition? A significant transformation of a congregation and its relationship to its building and property. So that can happen in a whole variety of ways. And I want to say first, right away, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're closing. And that's a really important thing to be clear about. Transition can mean closure, but it can mean a whole lot of other things. For example, a sacred place is in transition when the building, excuse me, I'm doing allergies this week. A sacred place is in transition when the building is empty most of the week and the congregation wants to be better stewards of their space. They may be an active congregation, but they've got empty property. So an example of this, in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of congregations were experiencing the baby boom. This is my generation. They had lots of kids. So I was in a congregation in St. Louis, a vital congregation, vital Presbyterian church. They still had 600 members, so they're doing well. But in their heyday, they had 3,000 members. And when they had 3,000 members, they built for themselves a 4-story education building. Well, now there are 300 members and they have many fewer children. The congregation tends to be more aging. The stats are that many folk are not doing the old thing where, you weren't involved in a church or a synagogue until your kid was going to be, you had children and then they were going to be baptized, or you wanted to have them bar bat mitzvah. But that fewer and fewer folk are doing that now. Fewer and fewer folks see that as necessary. So there are fewer children. So they had this 4-story building that they had a daycare on the first floor and then 3 floors of empty, 24/7, 365. And they said, we need to, this is really poor stewardship. We need to do something with this space to serve the community. So that's one thing. A church, a sacred place, not just a church, a synagogue as well. A sacred place is in transition when the congregation comes to terms with financial realities, which mean that it cannot support the maintenance and repair of the building or property alone. Those of you who work with historic buildings of any kind know that it is a hole in the ground into which you sink money. It can be very expensive. I served a church that had a slate roof, God bless us, and needed to replace that roof. If you have dealt with slate roofs in your work, you know what that costs. It's extremely expensive. HVAC systems in a lot of these properties are extremely expensive. And then you get things like foundation issues, window issues, which is huge. It's very expensive. Congregation that we were working with has some beautiful Tiffany windows, which is an enormous asset to them. But if you have ever looked into what it costs to repair a Tiffany window, it can sink a congregation's budget. And also then, when is a sacred place in transition? It's when the congregation has more buildings or property that it can use, and it desires to sell or lease part of the property. So, those folk in St. Louis decided they wanted to keep the property, but they could have decided, well, we could sell or lease this to someone else. And then it's their opportunity, their asset to work with. So those are the other piece is that a congregation can be in transition when it has decided to end its ministry and vacate the property. So that is one of the things that we work with. There are congregations that simply come to the end of their lives, and that they're going to merge with another congregation, or they're just going to close, and then they have a place that needs to be repurposed. So when we look at all of these different kinds of transition, we want to think about what options there are for congregations to consider when they come to the point of needing to transition all or part of their property. So the first one is to remain in place with new uses of unused spaces. So Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Philadelphia entered into a space sharing agreement in 2013 with 1812 Productions, which is a theater company. They're still there, by the way. They use a former school building. This is a Catholic congregation. They use a former school building as administrative offices and rehearsal space. The congregation still uses the sanctuary to worship. So there's this beautiful partnership, and we know a lot of those partnerships between congregations and arts organizations, congregations in healthcare, congregations in education. Sometimes I worked in a congregation in Massachusetts that was right across from the town hall, which was way too small for its current needs and was landlocked. But the congregation had a huge set of space in that 1950s wing that they added on to the 1700s meeting house. And so they made an agreement with the town to become sort of a community center that town organizations for youth or senior citizens would use. So they remain worshiping in that space, but now they have an income that allows them to do more things. So that's one option. Another option is to remain in place with the sale of non-essential assets. Now, non-essential assets can be empty land. It can be a parking lot, or it can be that building that is no longer needed, that extra building that is no longer needed. A number of these places are being considered for housing. So this example that you see here is a church that sold its entire property, and they rent back the sanctuary so that they can use that for $1 a year. That extends their life and their mission. Now, this particular case study, these single-story residences are market rate. I'm about to replace this slide in my slides with a story of a congregation that I'm a member of in Philadelphia. This is in Old City, which is the oldest part of the city of Philadelphia. It's not too far from Independence Hall. It had a parking area in this very urban, very landlocked place that they really didn't need and didn't use. But they also had been, in the wintertime, providing emergency housing for more than a dozen homeless men at that point. And one day they said, isn't there some way that we can do something about this? Isn't there some way that instead of just being the Band-Aid, we can help to help these folk to find more permanent housing? So they took a parking lot, and I want to tell you, this is not a big piece of land. And we just have opened permanent supportive housing for 34 previously homeless men and women. We did this in partnership with the city of Philadelphia and with a private funder, a private developer, and with an organization who will actually run this supportive housing. And to help to pay for this, the bottom floor of this 4-story building is able to be rented for retail space. So we still have our building where we worship and where we do the rest of our ministry. And the congregation is maybe 100, 120 members. But now this property that we didn't need, weren't really using, is now being used to serve the community, which is really a very exciting an exciting thing for us as a congregation. And another option for transition is for those congregations that are either merging with another church or simply ending their lives, what we call civic-minded, missionally aligned sale. Now, what happens in a number of congregations, if they just say the last person alive turn out the lights and then let a realtor do something with this property, is that it becomes market rate housing, luxury condos, depending on where you are, or as I've seen in other parts of the country, and maybe you've got some out by you, a bar, a restaurant, an event space, a retail space, something like that. What we're encouraging congregations to consider, and I'm going to talk more in a few minutes about how they can consider this, are looking at what are the needs of their community and what is their mission? How can they align the transition of this space with what has been their mission? For example, this just happened out in Portland, Oregon, Central Lutheran Church, a mid-century church in Portland. After the pandemic, they were smaller. They could no longer support their building with the congregation alone, and they decided they would sell their building, and they sold it to the Portland Youth Philharmonic, the oldest continuously operating youth orchestra in the country. Who knew? In Portland, Oregon. So they've got space now, not only for performances, but for individual classes, instrumental classes. It's like a conservatory, and for rehearsal space. This congregation had a long legacy of music being central to their lives, as well as serving youth. And so being able to make connections with these folk, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that happens, allowed them to sell this in a way that made them feel like this property was continuing their mission and was meeting a need in the community. There are so many possible uses for sacred places that we have seen, either all of a space or part of a property. Community Arts Center, there's an Episcopal church in rural Massachusetts that has become a community arts center. I just showed you a music conservatory, rehearsal spaces, practice studios, galleries, and artist studios. A lot of sacred places have great wall space and often spaces that could be turned into artist studios. Health clinics. I was talking with some folk in Texas, where in very rural communities, folk had to travel long distances to get health care. And there were a number of hospitals exploring using unused space in churches to provide regular health care, varieties of regular health care for folk in those rural communities. We've talked about housing, not just affordable housing, but there are all kinds of housing: re-entry from incarceration, abused women and children, housing for mentally or emotionally handicapped adults, sober housing, student housing, lots of different kinds of housing. A church I know has had excess property, and they had a member who had an adult son with Down syndrome. They built a house for supportive housing for adults with Down syndrome on that property. Schools, all kinds of education in these places, youth centers, co-working spaces is one of the things that we have seen become very popular. Large sanctuaries, once you take out those pews, have the capacity to be divided in interesting ways to make co-working spaces. The same with large halls. Offices for all sorts of things, social service agencies, a whole variety of possibilities for office space. And then my personal favorite. This is in St. Louis. And unfortunately, well, I'll tell you the story, and then I'll give you the kind of sad ending about this. An indoor skate park and building trades education center. This is when I wish I could see your faces right now, because this is so unexpected. Skate laborious. That's what the inside looks like. This was a Roman Catholic church that the diocese had consolidated this congregation into another church, and they sold the rectory. They sold an education. No, they sold the place where the nuns lived to a home for abused women. They sold the school across the street to the city, which put there a juvenile detention center. And then they had this beautiful, at one time, it was the largest Gothic church west of the Mississippi. Beautiful, beautiful thing. They sort of gave it to the folk who were running the home for abused women, but they had no money to keep this in repair. And so over about a 20-year period, this place was simply falling down. And a set of 3 guys who were contractors bought the place from the women's shelter, and they created in it this indoor skate park. They would say to people, your kids can come here to a drug-free, supervised, safe place, or they can go across the street to the juvenile detention center. And in addition to providing this safe place, they began to train young adults in all kinds of building trades to try to work on the repair of this place. So everything from masonry to carpentry, electrical, glass, everything that needs to, and a lot of these trades, by the way, as you may know, there are fewer and fewer people that are trained to do the kind of masonry you need to do to repair a place like this. They were well underway. They were going like gangbusters. And then the biggest tragedy that every congregation of any kind fears happened. There was a fire. And sadly, the whole place was destroyed. And last I heard, they were hoping to do something on the land to try to continue to serve the community they were serving. But I was there. I took these pictures, and it was when I first walked in, I sort of gasped and went, oh my God, this is awful. And then as I listened to them and I walked around and I realized what was going on, it really was quite amazing. So let's talk about how to do this in a healthy way. I need to say to you that there are 3 words that I sort of epitomizes what we see so often in congregations that are struggling these days: fear, exhaustion, and grief. They are grieving what they remember as the glory days, often the 1950s and 60s. It was the 1960s, believe it or not, when the current downturn in the number of folk involved in organized religion began. And I will tell you, as a historian, that the 1950s were a complete anomaly in the United States. There were more people involved in organized religion in the 1950s than at any other time in the history of this country. And folk will often say, well, wait a minute, what about those early days, in the revolution where everybody was required to go to church? First of all, we're talking about a tiny part of the United States and a much smaller number of people. And even then, there were lots of people that were not involved in organized religion. That's one of those historical things that a lot of folks miss. So the 1950s were an anomaly, but for most folk who are over the age of 60 today, that's what they think of as the norm. And so there's a lot of sadness and a lot of grief about why and how did that happen and why isn't it like that? And if only we could, a lot of if only we coulds. And there's fear for what's going to happen to this place. I was working with a congregation that was probably going to have to sell its building. And this woman said, well, I had hoped that my daughter was going to have her wedding there. Her daughter was 5. Another woman said, I hoped I would have my funeral here. And she didn't. So there's just this great kind of fear. What am I going to do with this place that has been so much a part of my life and such an important part of my life? But there's also exhaustion, as there are fewer volunteers, fewer folk who are able to do the work required to keep it up, to keep up that property, they're just exhausted. And when somebody has to drop out because they move or they die or they're simply physically incapable anymore, often there's no one to take their place. So this is really tough on folks. And there's one of my younger staff members once said, well, why don't they just close? It's logical. And I said, no, there's nothing logical about this. This isn't just bricks and mortar. There's an emotional connection to these spaces that cannot be minimized. So being able to transition a space in a healthy way first requires working with folk where they are and understanding it's not just bricks and mortar for them. So we say one of the things that needs to be done is to help folk anticipate the need to use and manage and sustain any property in new ways, and to begin planning on that before it's too late. We'll have congregations come to us and they'll say, can you help us to, be able to still keep this place going? And we'll say, how many members do you have? And they'll say 10. And we'll say, how long of a runway financially do you have? And they'll say, we run out of money in 5 months. And there is almost nothing we can do for them except to give them some guidance on how they might transition in a missionally aligned way. The sooner folk can make decisions about how to preserve their property, the better. And we encourage folk to consider beginning with small transitions, like sharing more of their space with the community in bigger ways, taking the risk of inviting people in. I often laugh. The first congregation I served, which is in rural northern lower Michigan, we had a building that had a couple of AA groups in it. And I always remember a church council meeting when folk were complaining that the AA groups were not cleaning up the sink in the kitchen as well as they should have. And so we should stop having them use the building. So we say to people, yes, you can build in agreements with space sharing partners about what they should do, but understand that it's not always going to look pristine, and you don't necessarily want it to, because you want it to be used. So consider the small transitions to get folk used to it, and then consider the larger transitions that might be necessary, like things like co-ownership or sale or lease back or a civic-minded sale. There's a long journey toward a healthy transitioning, but it requires time and it requires energy on behalf of a congregation. So one of the tools that we use to try to help do that healthy transitioning is we encourage congregations to develop a property mission statement. So a lot of congregations of varying faiths will have a mission statement that guides their life, how they live as a congregation, what they do. Sometimes those are simple, sometimes those are quite lengthy and full of detail. But in almost every case that I have encountered, none of those mission statements include the property. They don't talk about the fact that this property has a role. Remember way back, we talked about the beginning of this 40 minutes ago, we talked about the civic value of these places, that they are considerable assets to the community in a whole variety of ways. All of that is involved in the mission of this property, which is certainly tied to the mission of the congregation, but actually can extend past the life of a congregation. This is mission-driven space utilization. And we work with them to do strategic visioning, not planning, strategic visioning around how they understand this property could be used. It's very high-level decision-making, and it gives folk a sense of control over the future of the space that is really helpful. Okay, so I got ahead of myself. Congregations are weary and in grief. They are decision fatigued, and they are often stuck in the weeds. They have that albatross around their neck, and all they can see is that this thing is hanging around my neck and it smells and it's weighing me down and I don't know what to do about it. They need some kind of a guidepost for a new stage in the life cycle of this property and potentially the congregation itself. So that's why we developed this tool. And it can be used in a variety of ways. It can guide the parish as it considers various outside users for the property. Who do you want to have use this property, and who do you not want to have? So one of the funny ones, I was in a small town in Indiana, an Episcopal church, and they were near a college that had a film studies program. And some college students had approached them. They had a very beautiful sanctuary, and the students wanted to use that sanctuary in a film. So the congregation asked what the script was, what it was about, and they thought, yeah, why not? So they, the students paid them to use the film for the film, and they saw the film, and it was lovely. And a year later, another set of students came, and they also wanted to shoot a film there. And so the parish said, well, what's this one about? And the answer was zombies. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to use the sanctuary and have, like fake blood around and zombies and stuff. So the congregation had a conversation with themselves about this. People who see this will see our space, and because it's local, they're going to know it's our space. And is this how we want to be identified? And they said, we like you. We think you guys are doing great work. We don't want to have zombies. So they're having a sense of what the mission of the property was, help them to understand, one thing is an appropriate use, another maybe not quite an appropriate use for our property. So that's one way. You can use a property mission statement for community fundraising, to be able to say to the community around them as they're maybe raising funds for capital repairs, hey, this is the mission of this property. It's not just for us, it's for you too. And so we are hoping that you will help support us so that we can continue to have this property available to be used in this variety of ways, whatever the mission may be. Another way is to help interpret to the community the purpose of your property and how it contributes to the well-being of the community. This can have some interesting uses that a lot of congregations don't think about. And one of them has to do with zoning. Sometimes congregations want to do creative things with their property, but they are stuck in a zoning, a zone that prohibits that particular usage. So sometimes a mission statement can be used when they go forward to their civic officials to say, we understand the mission of our property to include this thing, and we would like you to consider a zoning abatement for us, or a tax abatement for us in some cases. It can also help guide decision-making if a significant transition of the property needs to take place, like a sale, to say, well, this is how we hope that this property can be used. And so we're going to reach out into the community in very specific ways to try to connect with people who might help us to use it that way. And I'll talk a minute about how we do that. And then finally, to recruit space users who are missionally aligned with the parish. So when they're looking for space users, who do we go to? What kinds of organizations do we want to try to connect with that might use space in this parish? So how do people draft this property mission statement? Well, it's a team approach, and they look at several things. They look at the legacy of the congregation. What has happened in the past? What did the ancestors use this space for? And the ancestors could be still alive, some of them, and could talk about the different things that people have used the space for. What are the mission and vision and values of this congregation? Who are the community stakeholders? And how can we talk with them? And I'll talk more about that in a sec. What do they think could be the possibilities around the mission of this parish? And then we encourage folk to do two things. We have two tools called a facilities walk and a neighborhood walk. We've discovered that in congregations, especially those with particularly old buildings, or congregations where members of the congregation have aged, is that often there's a number of members of any congregation who have not actually gone through the entire property in years and don't know what's there, don't know what condition it's in, and so can't imagine what it might be used for. So we have a whole tool where we encourage people to do that. And also we've discovered in many churches, both rural and urban, by the way, that not all members of a congregation necessarily live in the neighborhood where the congregation is, where the property is. So they don't know the neighborhood. If they're older, they don't know what's going on in the schools. They don't know what the needs are. And so we encourage them to walk the neighborhood or drive the neighborhood in the case of a rural congregation and see what's happening, what is out there, who might potential partners be in the use of this space. So we ask them to ask powerful questions. What might your property look like on any given day if it were truly fulfilling the mission of your congregation? That's a really fun question because we ask people to put on their Imagineer hats, not look at what it looks like right now. Don't look at the dead albatross, but look at the possibilities and don't say but. I have outlawed the word of the use of the word but when they're doing this. Well, we could have a feeding center for hundreds of people, but no but. Just what would you imagine? And then what wouldn't you want to have happen in the building? We talked about that. Why was this building originally built? How is each space in the buildings and the land, if applicable, being used now, and how was it in the past? And if you had to describe the mission of each space in your building and the land in a few words, what would you say? It's amazing what comes out of asking those kinds of very basic but very powerful questions. And then the next powerful question is, who are the people in my neighborhood? This church is Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian Church. It's in Brooklyn. And a number of years ago, they had a local artist paint this mural. By the way, this is one wall. This mural goes around all four walls of their sanctuary. The people in this mural are not drawn after members of the congregation. The people in this mural are all portraits of people who were living in the community when the artist drew this picture. And his point was, every time you are in worship here, you should remember that you are also carrying this community. And these are the people, as Mr. Rogers used to sing, these are the people in your neighborhood. To keep in mind who they are. Who are the people and organizations and institutions for whom your property is important? We invite people to consider the neighbors their stakeholders, that these folk also have a stake in the building. We have a couple of tools that we use to actually invite congregations to get those stakeholders into the building, to look at the property, and then to sit and talk with members of the congregation about what the unmet needs in their neighborhood, in their community are, and how might those needs be met, and who might be partners with them. Because congregations sometimes think, if we're going to do this big new project, we have to do it ourselves. We don't have the people, we don't have the money. Absolutely true. But there are partners in your community who do have the people and who may have the money. And so discover who your stakeholders are. They're your current and your recent space users. They're folk who align with your mission. They're folk who, if your congregation and its property disappeared tomorrow, who would it make a difference to other than the members of the church? Who would it make a difference to other than the members of the church? There was a study done just very recently, just a few years ago, by the Brookings Institution about the impact of the closing of African-American congregations on the health care of African-American communities in urban areas. It's a fascinating piece that shows even that often those sacred places were used for clinics, for vaccination clinics, for many of them had parish nurses or a variety of ways, but also just its existence on that corner or on that block provided a safe place, sometimes mental health counseling with clergy or other professionals. It had an enormous impact on the neighborhood. And folk in the congregation and people in the community don't always talk to each other enough to understand. So we have these community conversations that we encourage people to have and talk together. So what happens when you are working on a property mission statement and you talk to the people in your neighborhood and to your congregation about this? Why is it powerful? There are several paradigm shifts that happen as a result of this work. Your property has a mission. We're turning it from an albatross to an asset in the eyes of the people. Your property has a mission itself. It has a tremendous potential and possibility, even if it feels like the walls are crumbling and you have to kick the furnace 100 times to make it work. And there's been somebody keeping this place together with duct tape and rubber bands for so many years that you feel that it's a lost cause. It still has a mission. And your property has civic value. It's not just valuable to you, it's valuable to a lot of people in your community. And if you reach out to them, you may discover that they're willing in a lot of ways to partner with you to help this space again grow as an asset to this community and not simply be an albatross around your neck. And then finally, your property can live out its mission, whether or not the current faith community owns or controls it. If you do a careful job of working on transition from an early rather than a later time, that property's mission can continue in service to this community in all of those ways that we talked about on a previous slide. Paradigm shifts, critical. So what do these look like? Now, I know, I'm not sure you can read this depending on how big your screen is. This mission statement talks about the history. It was created as a central gathering space for a growing community that would serve as a place of connection, community, and caring. Those three words for this particular congregation became central to their understanding of what the purpose of their building was. Connection, community, and caring. This is the church that partnered with the town hall across the street to become a community center, serving seniors, children, doing feeding programs of a variety of ways. They had a commercial kitchen that they began to do. The town and the local YMCA began to do cooking classes out of for all kinds of people, from teenagers to adults. It really became critical to their understanding of who they were. This one understood that for generations, they have been at the intersection of civic and spiritual life. They saw their parish building as a community asset. They saw the importance of being welcoming and safe space. Those two things became critical for them, that sense of welcome and safe space. Nourished by diversity, we work together with our community across the community and the region to further a world filled with those virtues Christ has taught us: compassion, solidarity, and social justice. That really helped them to crystallize what it is they wanted this space to become now and into the future as well. So we have almost hit the hour mark, and I could talk on at some length, but I would like to have some time to respond to any questions that you may have. So folks, how do we do questions?
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany. I'll be reading the comments and questions that have been posed so far. One comment that was made was previous to what you were speaking about, what happens here in Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
That there were similar type issues in Oklahoma City where we saw two large churches that could no longer support two large campuses. They sold the mid-century historic church complex, and it's since been demoed for mixed use.
Oh no.
Yeah, quite quite hard on our community. There's
Can I stop
also
a second with that? The
absolutely.
mid-century modern thing. My home church was mid-century modern. Beautiful example of it. It also has been demoed and is now being built as market rate townhouses. I can't even begin to tell you. So it's where I was married, where I was ordained. It breaks my heart. But a lot of congregations who are in mid-century structures do not understand themselves as historic. We combat this all the time. And we're always telling people, technically anything older than 50 years old is historic. So I have begun to describe myself as mid-century modern and to say, right? But this is a word we have to get out there, that mid-century modern structures are important in architecture, are important, historically important architecture to be preserved. And what's great about mid-century, a lot of those spaces have a great capacity, especially if you take pews out, to be incredibly flexible for a whole variety of uses. So anyway, that's my mid-century lecture.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. There is another question here. It says, what have you seen work well for community outreach or engagement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have two tools that we use. One is this simple community conversation. And what we do is a congregation can do this themselves. They don't have to hire us to do this. But if they do, this is what we do. We help them to identify leaders in the community, organizations or individuals in a broad array of sectors, arts, education, healthcare, government, and especially in city planners. I love city planners, and we need to get them more involved in this work. Social services, nonprofits, and philanthropies. We get them to do some research. What do they have? Do they have an arts council in their community that can help them connect them to a whole set of arts groups? And so we asked them for a community conversation to get this list together and to try to get at least like 25 names on that list. And then to invite them to come to the church or synagogue on a weekday afternoon, not a Monday or a Friday. Those are deal killers. But on a weekday afternoon, and get a tour of the facility, and then sit with the congregation and have those folk tell the congregation, what are they seeing? What are the unmet needs in this community? And after they have walked around this space, what can they imagine might happen here? This simple little thing is just amazing every time I see it happen, because the church assumes everybody knows or the synagogue, they assume everybody knows what their space looks like. But they realize that the vast majority of these people have never been in it. Or if they have, it was for a wedding and they were in the sanctuary, or a funeral in the sanctuary, or they've walked past it and seen the outside, but they don't know what the asset looks like. They don't know all those rooms that might be available for use. And so then after that conversation, the last question we have is, who's not here that needs to see this place? And then the congregation is encouraged to follow up with that, to contact folk, to get in touch with partners, and therefore to find partners who can either use the space sort of on a small scale, or potential partners for large scale, for a ground lease or for anchor tenant. Anchor tenant is another term that we use a lot with congregations. Instead of a lot of tiny little people using one room at a time, find an organization that needs a lot of space and have an anchor tenant. We have a bigger process that's called community asset mapping. And I don't know if any of you have ever been involved in asset mapping. But it is a way for folks to look at what they have and what they have access to. And our take on that is that we invite them to ask more people from the community. A great asset mapping is going to have anywhere between 30 and 50 people at it from the community. They do the same thing. They take a tour, but then we sit down, and I think there was a picture on a slide a little ways back that had sticky notes on it. We asked the people there to write down all of the assets that they have, that they understand that this particular congregation has. Now, they're physical assets, and that's the easiest one, right? But people don't often think small, right? Not only do they have a big room, but they have chairs and tables in that room. They have Wi-Fi in that room. They have AV equipment in that room. They have a kitchen adjacent to that room. Physical assets, human assets. What kinds of people are in this congregation that are great human assets? Economic assets that the congregation either has or has access to. Is there a community foundation in the community? I love community foundations because they often have donor advised funds that can be used to help spaces like this, or they're willing to take on a larger project or a training or something like that. What kind of associations and institutions do they have access to? Everything from Rotary, Lions Club, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, or institutions like hospitals, or arts centers, or whatever that they have access to. And then narrative assets. What's the story of this place? What captures people's imagination? I was working with a congregation in the Midwest that had been a center. They were established in the early 1800s. They were a center for immigrants, for people coming to this country, but moving west. And they helped folk then to find safety and security and community. And they realized, wow, that's something that's an asset from our history that still has meaning. So they put all these assets together, and then we asked them to begin to think outside the box about how some of these assets might come together. So if you remember that story I told about the St. Louis congregation that had the 4-story education building, we did an asset mapping with them. And as I walked around with a set of community folk who were taking the tour, I kept hearing them say to each other, there are bathrooms in every single one of these classrooms. Now, the congregation had thought really probably in the end, the only thing this building was good for was a school. But the folk who saw those bathrooms said, housing. That was the first thing that came to their minds. There's plumbing all throughout this building. Now, how often do you look at a building and think asset, plumbing? But it was huge in a further conversation about how might this be used in a whole variety of possibilities for housing. So, that's the sort of thing that one of these conversations can help open up.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing and expanding that information for us. There's another quick question here. They really liked or loved really the conversion to a skate park. And they're curious if you've seen any other unique conversions.
Mm-hmm. There's a Presbyterian church outside of Pittsburgh that became, those places that have like those climbing walls.
Right.
That now the sanctuary is a big sanctuary with tall walls, and they had also a fellowship hall with fairly high ceilings. And so it became a recreation center that included climbing walls in the sanctuary. There's a congregation that I have been to in Montreal in Canada, an Episcopal church that still has a congregation that worships there. They partnered with a circus school, not elephants and lions, but aerialists. So think Cirque du Soleil, that kind of thing. It's a Gothic architecture style, so extremely high ceilings and beautiful, beautiful stained glass windows. And so I was at a performance there in the church with the aerialists. It was phenomenal. It was utterly beautiful, with the lighting that they put into place and the use of the lighting. They backlit a number of the windows because this happened at night. So they backlit a number of the windows so that they became part of the performance. It was just an amazing thing. Event spaces of all kinds.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway.
Those are both really great examples. We have one more question that we'll go ahead and can you please speak to the grant opportunity for sacred spaces?
Yes.
Thank you.
The National Fund. I wish we had a gazillion grants. We don't, sadly. And let me say, I'll talk about the National Fund. Let me say a word about grants a minute. So the SHPOs in a lot of states, I should have researched this and I didn't. Does Oklahoma SHPO give grants to religious organizations? Can either one of you or Lynn answer that question?
This is Linda. We don't
Yeah.
have a grant
Okay.
program for that.
All right. Well, you need to. But in a lot of states, there are grants for historic spaces that will include historic religious places. Other than that, it's a real challenge for congregations to be able to get grants because a great many foundations don't want to get enmeshed in religion for a whole variety of reasons. For the obvious reason that they don't want to be seen as favoring one religion over another. And for the reason, and this is one to think about, most congregations, especially if they're smaller, do not have professionally paid bookkeepers. Many of them have volunteers. And big foundations think this is not a reliable bookkeeping system. So that's the other particular challenge that a lot of religious institutions face. So we encourage congregations to, if they've got a historic structure, especially if it is on a register of some kind, either national, state, or local, or in a historic district, we encourage them to form separate 501c3s that are exclusively dedicated to the maintenance and repair and renovation of the historic structure. There are some foundations then that will make grants to those organizations, to a friends organization whose mission is excessively clear, exceedingly clear, that it's just for the property and not for, no money is going into the mission life of the church. So some folk have done that. I served a congregation in Connecticut that had an 1807 New England meeting house, and they formed that 501c3. They've been very successful. The other thing that those 501c3s can also be used for is corporate matching gifts. Most corporations will not allow matching gifts to be given to religious organizations, but many will allow it to be given to a historic preservation organization that is connected with a church or a synagogue. So that's a little piece related to that. Now the National Fund. National Fund was started 9 years ago by us, the National Trust, and the Lilly Endowment, with an understanding that so many of these sacred places were really facing significant capital needs and no money. So the qualifications, I will invite you to check out the website for the National Fund, which is fundforsacredplaces.org. That may be, I don't know if you can put that in a chat at all or something, but fundforsacredplaces.org. Oh, I can put it in the chat. Well. Sorry, I can't type and talk. The requirements to qualify for this fund are that the place doesn't have to be on the National Register or a state register, but it has to have the possibility of qualifying to be on a register. It has to have a vital congregation. The reason is we're not going to want to make a $500,000 grant for the preservation of a space that in 5 years gets sold and then demoed to become, condos. So it's got to have a congregation that is still likely to be in existence into the near future anyway. These are matching grants. So the congregation has to have the capability to raise the matching funds. Now, I'll tell you that one of the things that goes with being accepted into this program is that there's considerable training that is attached to it. So there is training on capital fundraising for those congregations who need it, along with a number of other technical assistance pieces. And one of our staff members who is assigned to shepherd this congregation through the entire process from beginning to end. The other thing that is a qualification is that the matching funds must be new money. They can't say, oh, we have a $5 million endowment. That'll, we can take from that to match it. No, we don't want congregations depleting that. We want them, part of the purpose of this is for them to find new partners, to find new sources. So it needs to be new money either raised from within the congregation, but ideally from congregation and community. And as well, this work has to be work that is not yet done. So you can't apply for this for work that's already completed, because it's really important to the fund that they work with congregations to make sure they have, for example, historically, Secretary of the Interior standards are being met for historic preservation on these projects. So to make sure that there is a preservation architect that is attached to the project in some way. So those are the big pieces that go with getting one of these grants. The process is in January or February each year, there will be an announcement that applications are being received for this fund. And there is on the website, if you go to it, you'll see there is a webinar. There's a webinar recording that's on there from this year's webinar that goes in detail through how to apply, how to do a successful application for this. We have simplified the application, so you don't need a grant writer necessarily to do this. Certainly if you have one, that's great. But, folk who aren't grant writers, if they follow the instructions, can do this. So there's this webinar. So we encourage people to attend the webinar, have someone attend the webinar. And then it's, of course, like this one, it's recorded and then people can watch it later. And then submit the application. Again, because this money takes a while to come to you, you have to match half of it before you can get half of it. This can't be an emergency situation. The roof is falling in. That's not going to be a good candidate for this, because you got to do something about that now. But this is for capital projects that you can plan into the future. So you can find out lots more about it. It's a great opportunity for the right congregation. And the way I met partners was that I went to be an interim pastor at a congregation that had gotten a national fund grant. It was an extraordinary experience for us. And the assistance that was given to us was absolutely critical to the success of raising the funds.
Thank you so much for doing the presentation for us today.